We're here for another installation of Attempted Intelligence. This time, what we're going to discuss is the concept of locus of control, which can be broken up into internal and external locus of control as opposing ends of the spectrum. So, you said you found some stuff?
I did find some stuff. I did find this topic interesting. But, what I found was it's a psychological concept that refers to how strongly one believes their actions influence their experiences or their life experiences. Internal being that they strongly believe in their actions affecting their experiences, and external believing that their actions don't have a huge impact or influence on their experiences.
So I'm going to attempt to maybe make that a little cleaner. Internal locus of control, in my understanding, is that you believe that your actions lead to outcomes. You're able to control outcomes, at least on some level. External locus of control means that you believe outcomes are primarily controlled by things that are not you.
Okay, outside of you, yeah.
So maybe as a way to attempt to map a real life thing onto it, you get in a car accident and it was the other person's fault, right? You get into a car accident and it was because of the sun. You get into a car accident, we'll call that external locus of control. Right? The sun is the reason you got in a car accident. There was nothing you could do about it. Versus internal locus of control would suggest that, yes, I was blinded by the sun. However, the moment I was blinded by the sun, I could have pulled down the visor. Right? So you're beginning to believe that although a negative outcome occurred, there might have been things that you could have done about it.
Well, that kind of makes sense, because one of the examples I did see was an education one, where it said that a student with internal locus of control strongly believes that their efforts in studying and doing all the extra work will result in their grades and their circumstances, where one with external locus of control essentially goes, it's teacher's bias, so the testing was unfair, or blah, blah, blah. They have all these excuses.
I wouldn't necessarily call them excuses per se. I would call it a worldview. Like, I understand where you're saying it is an excuse, but I would call it more of a kind of a philosophical lens, a viewpoint. Who would you predict would be more likely to succeed in the face of difficulty in that situation? The student who put more effort into their own studying and believed that their studying had an impact on the outcome, or the student who believed that it was the teacher's responsibility to ensure that they passed the test?
I feel like it would be the first one, the one with internal locus of control, because they're motivated to move past challenges because they believe that their actions actually affect and matter and change.
Has some impact.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean directly that my effort will directly lead to a specific outcome.
But influence.
It'll at least take me in that direction.
Yeah.
There's an old saying that people probably construct this differently, but it seems like a Christian ethic, where if I believe it goes, Lord, grant me, grant me the strength to accept the things that I cannot change, grant me the grace to accept the things that I cannot change, the strength to change the things that I can, and the intelligence to know the difference.
Yes.
Right? Did you see, when you were looking at locus of control, that as it's modified and as it's been better understood over time, that it really isn't an either or for an individual? It's you, depending on what you're looking at, or your predilections, your predispositions, you may be more internal, you may be more external, but you're not always.
One, yeah.
Right?
I did see that, yeah. And it also doesn't really make sense, even just the general concept that we've been talking about. We can't do a black and a white, we can't do a left or a right. It's always going to be one of those things where we can kind of tip the scale on either side.
And depending on what you are looking at, there are times when there's nothing you could do, right? I don't know that most of us could do anything about an asteroid impact, right? We accept that there is a danger of asteroid impact. For the most part, it doesn't happen, right? So that's something where you'd have a hard time putting internal locus of control on that as a possible mediator, right? Or you could go Armageddon.
I was going to say, unless you were,
Bruce Willis, right? But you need Ben Affleck,
Yes.
Right? Okay, you need them.
And you need space drills.
Okay. Now, that said, the old saying that I gave, grant me the grace to accept the things that I cannot change, the strength to change the things that I can, and the intelligence to know the difference, seems to be an observation of this concept prior to it being articulated, right? So if I remember correctly, it was the 60s. I think it was the 60s when this concept was articulated in this form, and then work's been done. So it's a phenomenon that has existed consistently over time. It's just that it's been written about, it's been described in a specific way, more work's been done on it, it's been experimented with. Did you see any of the information that pointed to broad cultural concepts where some cultures are more internal locus of control and some cultures are more external?
Like internal groups of people?
So a culture broadly, the people that could be identified as being part of a culture, and that culture carries more internal locus of control versus external.
I did not get to that.
Okay, so there is some information that suggests a culture. So culture, I would define, and not everybody would agree, but I would define culture as shared ideas and shared behaviors.
Okay.
So in some ways, so you're from Stony Creek, I was born and raised in North York, but we're both Canadian.
Okay.
Right? So there are some things that we share culturally and some things that we don't. And also my personal culture is very much influenced by the people that I hung around who have different identifiable cultures than the one that I would be claimed to descend from.
Fair enough.
So the culture that I would be claimed to descend from is not one that informs me heavily, right? Whereas the culture that I would be claimed to descend from seems to inform you more,
Yeah.
right? And that's just the way it is. So there's certain points at which we share some ideas and behaviors because of things that were outside of us.
Right.
But then I would hazard to say that you and I both much more lean to internal locus of control. I do everything I can.
As soon as I read it, I was like, which one am I?
Yeah. And my observation would suggest that you're internal.
Yes.
Mostly.
Yes.
Right?
Leaning more towards
It doesn't mean that you don't accept that some things are out of your control. But you're like, I'm going to do everything I can, right, to get what I'm looking for.
Exactly.
So there are some cultures where if the culture dominantly carries the shared idea and the shared behavior of greater levels of internal locus of control, on almost all measures, they have better outcomes.
As a culture as a whole.
Broadly.
Okay.
Broadly. Especially when you take people from from one culture and you place them in a different context.
Interesting.
So if you take people from a given culture and that has a higher level of internal locus of control, and you place them in another context that isn't their native location, they seem to do well on most measures. You would think that because they're outsiders, and the context that they've gone into would have some prejudice against them, that they would have a harder time. Now they may, and there is very likely prejudice against them. However, cultures with an internal locus of control do seem to show better outcomes regardless of stumbling blocks, regardless of prejudice. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you've come across? Is that something that you would predict without necessarily pointing to one culture or another culture as hierarchical, right? Just cultures that you're aware of that say it's really your responsibility for almost everything.
I've had some people really impress me. Like
Okay.
they're say writing a book and have 4 kids and 2 jobs and all these other things, and they're working on the business plan and all these other things. I'm like, where are you getting this motivation from, And understanding where they come from culturally and with their family background, all these other things. I've seen it in various different cultures.
Yeah, it's not one culture.
Yeah, various different cultures and various different people with this kind of internal locus control, and they represent that culture group that they come from, but at the same time, it almost seems like it's just them as an individual.
Yeah, and I think there's something to that, because we can put some weight into culture as shared ideas and shared behaviors as something that you, as an individual, take something from. So no matter which individual we're talking about, they will agree with some pieces of a culture and not agree with others, or they'll perform some more than others. but there is some form of influence that it has on an individual. And then sometimes when you see somebody that is from a culture that you wouldn't predict has a high level of internal locus of control as part of the culture, and they have it,
Right.
then you can say that they haven't taken the dominant discourse of the culture that they're in. Now, for me, there's a category that I like to talk about that I call the category of undeniable.
Okay.
Right? The category of undeniable is no matter what is placed in your way, you're going to do everything you can anyways. Now that doesn't mean that it equates to top level success.
Okay.
But are there people that you know that no matter their circumstance, they're going to keep making some progress, even if it's slow,
Yes.
through essentially sheer will,
Yes.
right? And obviously some skill, right? So I would map my category, and it's the first time I said this in a dispersed forum, right? But there's a category that I like to call undeniable. There's somebody might have almost no money, but you know that you can't hold that person down. It's not possible.
Yeah.
They might have no car, right? There was a CrossFit athlete that I came across who is from England, a woman in her later 30s. She's an amputee, essentially slightly below the elbow. She Olympic lifts. That's undeniable.
There's a will, there's a way.
Right. Well, if you believe that things are supposed to be done a certain way, right? That's outside of you, and you won't find a solution.
The rules are lift that weight to this height, whatever way you can.
Well, not necessarily whatever way you
Yeah.
can within this pattern.
Yeah, within this.
And there's all kinds of ways to solve that.
Right.
So if you believe that things are supposed to be done a way, you believe something external to you,
Right.
and you won't attempt to find a novel solution.
Right.
But if you believe that there's a way to get to that end result, and I just got to solve the problem, you're going to fall into more of an internal locus of control in my mapping, and you're going to hit the category that I like to call undeniable, right? My preference in life, and I've said this on one of the videos previously, I don't like superficial stuff very much. I don't seem to do well with it. I talked about the buttons and how, the amount of buttons down the middle of a shirt,
Right.
they have to be sewn on buttons, they can't be snap buttons. That will take you more seriously in a given culture.
Mhm.
I don't like that. I tend to prefer to dissolve superficial categories and identify things that are the same kind of regardless of context. That's my preference. It doesn't mean I'm right, but it's what drives me.
Right.
And then when I see somebody essentially ignore the superficial stuff and start to show me or be observably internally motivated, internally controlled, I have a greater affinity to that,
Okay.
right? I've said before also when I hear something that I like, I'm more careful with
Yes.
it because it pulls on my dumb strings,
Right.
right? So I think the thing to attempt to turn over to you for some thoughts is there something that you can observably see in comparison to people who think the outside world is to blame versus they're to blame? Not necessarily in a victim sense,
I understand.
but the things that are happening are because of stuff that's outside of you versus stuff that's inside of you.
Just giving what I've seen in my life an actual categorical name, I now see that the people that really were inspirational and motivated and all these other things, these words that we use like driven and motivated and all these other things, determined, these are words that I'm now realizing are just describing this internal locus of control. In the sense that I'm observing it, in the sense that these people are motivated through problem solving and getting across these challenges because they see it as something that is something they can influence with effort. So they might not actually, it's that pursuit of happiness. They might not actually reach their goal, but they're going to try their darndest to get there.
Well, they're going to make some progress.
Exactly.
Right.
And it's also that kind of idea where you're making progress, and as long as you're still making progress, you feel like you still have that influence, that impact, you can still can kind of change something.
Sure.
Right?
I think the point that I'd like to make, and the reason I was it seemed like I was going to interject, is just the idea that you're saying, Now I kind of know what I was looking at. What I would say is, again, there's a phenomenon that seems to be well described by the concept of locus of control.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that that's the right description or the most accurate description. It's the one that we can wield right now.
Yeah, like for this discussion, right?
Or even as a lens to view things through.
Yes, definitely. To add another lens. Anyway.
Yeah, so the one of my drives here in these conversations is to attempt to share varying lenses that might be useful to view the world through. It doesn't mean they're the right ones. It means that they can be wielded, at least by us, and that maybe others can do it. They don't have to, right? But I think there's some value in it. Otherwise, I wouldn't bring the topic up for discussion.
Fair enough.
Right?
Fair enough. But just that, at different times to use these different lenses, and just at those times, I wish I had the lens to actually process the information and to be able to see that in that way with that lens to understand it better and then work forward and develop those thoughts and those ideas later.
Now, to attempt to map locus of control onto another set of concepts, right? We could talk about constructivism, positivism, post-positivism. I haven't seen this, and this might be something that's been done, but if you believe that, and this is kind of weird and somewhat counterintuitive in the way that this maps in my head, but if you believe internal locus of control, so the individual is able to influence outcomes, what would you map that to? Constructivism, positivism, or post-positivism? Constructivism is the truth is dependent on the individual, positivism is the truth is independent of the individual, post-positivism as a mix of both.
Well, you just saying internal, and then I would have to say that it's constructivism.
Okay.
It really has to be.
Yeah, so the individual constructs a reality.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing to me is that if I broaden that out, people who tend to talk about constructivism and, my reality, that actually seems to be in action what I note as people who would blame external circumstances for their problems. So the constructivist worldview, in my mapping, right, in my mapping, would say that the individual has impact. Right? But when I see constructivism used in research and used to talk about things, they're usually talking about things based on identifiable qualities or visually identifiable qualities about an individual and how they're impacted by external things. So I find it really interesting that it doesn't seem to me, in my reading, to map well. Because positivism would say, essentially, you could call it fatalistic. Right? There's a truth. There's nothing you can do about it. Right? Post-positivism would be what seems to be most observed by the researchers, the psychology researchers that have looked at this and say most people have some balance of internal versus external control. Post-positivism says there is an observable reality, but the humans constructing it are flawed. So it's better balanced. So I find it somewhat interesting, again, in my mapping, that it doesn't seem to make sense in what I view in the world.
But doesn't it make sense in the idea that we can't literally construct our world? Like the world exists, so there are going to be external factors that affect us, but it's almost using that general concept of constructivism and then using the new concept that we've introduced of internal locus to control those external factors to shape or construct it.
To interface with them to the best of your ability.
Right.
So I think the thing that I would say is that, let's just say we want to create change.
Right.
Create change on any level. Is the easier way to do that external to you or internal to you?
To create change.
Yeah, to influence change on some level. Who's the best actor? Things outside of you or things inside of you?
Well, I think that's dependent on your perspective. Because if you're looking externally, things are changing. Like the air is moving and light is heating and changing things, and there's bugs we can't see, all these other things that are just changing. But then if I physically want to see a representation of it, then I can just move something. I can just move a table, I can move a chair. But also it depends on what you want for that change.
So I think the point I'm trying to make is that to actually enact change, moment to moment, the individual is the best actor. The group is not.
Well, even if you're acting in the idea that you're looking at things differently or actually doing something that's the individual.
Yeah. So again, the point I want to make, and maybe to relate this to what's been observed, is that the individual who works more from an internal locus of control tends to have a better outcome over time, not necessarily immediately, and not without difficulty. It's not necessarily easy. It doesn't feel good. It's not nice. But the individual who operates more from an internal locus of control seems to have better outcomes in varying measures, depending on what you're looking at. And then the group that shares that as an idea, placed into a different context, seems to have better outcomes when placed into a different context.
Okay.
So I think the point is, if you'd like to make change, don't ask others to do it, because observably it doesn't seem to work all that well. If you do it more than asking others to do it, it seems to have more
better
effect.
results. Yeah.
Right. So if I was to say something, and obviously it resonates with me, so I'm worried on some level because, like I say, it falls on my dumb strings, that I may not necessarily succeed, and you may not necessarily succeed on the level that we'd like to, but if we're doing it on our own, it's going to work better. If I have to wait, if I have to go through lines and fill out forms and wait for things,
And depend on others.
yeah, I'd rather just do what I can do right now.
Right.
Yeah. I tend to optimize for things that you can't take away from me.
Yeah.
That's what I do, and I don't look to have a lot of material in life because I don't like that.
Right.
Right. So I tend to optimize for things you can't take away from me and things that I can do by myself.
It's very internal.
Right. Now, I'm not a good example of the pinnacle of success. Maybe one day I will be. I don't know. But there's nothing you can do to impede my progress.
Fair enough.
There's nobody that can impede my progress. Even if they lock me up, I'm still going to try to find some way to do it.
Right.
Right? It doesn't necessarily mean that that's good or that that's bad. It means it's me. Right? And I would say that you're pretty much the same way. Right? And both of us, by societal standards, are probably slow.
In like the progress of things?
Yes.
Yes, I would agree with that, yeah.
Well,
So I'm like, I'm not slow. We're doing the attempted intelligence and then you're calling us slow.
No. Slow in markers, in progress towards external markers of success.
Just to
that
clarify.
Other people would agree on.
Yes.
Right? And even if I am slow, so what? At least I'm attempting.
Fair enough.
See? And that's just an example of me saying, no.
Yeah.
No matter what you say, even if I am slow, I'm still going.
Yeah.
Right? So I think the main point here to take away is the more you utilize the internal locus of control, the more likely you are to have positive outcomes, either in the moment or over time. Right? That sits reasonably well.
I completely agree with that, yeah.
So there is some case to be made for acknowledging that things outside of you do impact you. It's hard to argue any other way, but the thing that is going to allow you to thrive over time is doing everything you can for yourself to the best of your ability. All right.